Hello everyone, today we talk about the Battle of Tagliacozzo for our Times and Meaning series that, as you know, is not quite the tactical reconstruction of the battle the way I am habituated to that we've made. In fact, in the yes, there is a battles playlist that includes also these, however less relevant times and meaning kind, but as you know, I mostly do this also for a living. I pick all available sources on a given battle and campaign, reconstruct that so that especially how battles were actually fought, like how every battle line, for what we can know, of course, worked or might have worked in the broader theory of the art of war, diachronically, comparatively, with all the precautions of the case. I make, and yet there is a historical dimension that goes beyond this. It is primarily political in nature. You understand the Battle of Tagliacozzo being a hell of a clash in so many ways. In fact, this will not even be just the only video in which I will talk about the general meaning of it, because the latter is really insane, right? It's just like this one, together with Markfeld, together with Brevin, together with Hastings, one of the major turning points in the history of mankind. Admittedly, like also Benevent 2 years before had been that crucial as well, had Manfred won and Charles of Anjou died. Like, we wouldn't even have the myth of Conradin per se. Think how instead important that turns out to be, and that's also largely why we're making this video. So everything is fortunately as irremediably intertwined, and as historians, most of what we do is to try to untangle the whole thing, to see more clearly into it, if we can, to also get some important, I would say, morale from it all. All right. This video will be slightly different compared to the other Times and Meaning kind, because we will place greater emphasis on not much the tactical dimension per se, the reconstruction of the battle, but they start to be well documented this time, so there would be actually a lot to say also about the campaign and so on. But the importance of flank attacks, that is something I'm also publishing about, and that, as you know, is in Western warfare really booming, apparently, at least as far as what we can document, in the 13th century. As I spent myself to explain over and over in any video in which I touched on the topic, and aside from the very example of Alarc de Valery at Tagliacozzo for Charles of Anjou, this tactics was not really a copy, a gift, something, say, a souvenir brought back from the Crusades in the imitation of the Turco-Mongol tactics that were pretty much all over the place in the eastern part of the same Europe at this point. It's rather a consequence of a series of factors. First of all, the fact that it's more documented than before, the fact that Western tactics at this point revolved around, and Tagliacozzo is one of the best examples of this, in fact, of this in-depth battle line deployment, which essentially funneled like all these forces gradually through reserves, one after the other, in this frontal confrontation that, of course, increases the effectiveness of a flank attack, because if the entire point is calibrating these forces, you basically destroy an enemy line of three, as they were mostly about in the economy of forces on the battlefield. Everything changes. Tagliacozzo is actually more than that, because by the time the flank attack is launched, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, that was mostly the array under Conradin of Swabia, and his, of course, his aiders, was made of, had scattered across the plains, and they actually managed to even recompact at a point. Today we will not see it in great depth, that's why I'm also talking about it at the beginning, recompact and even successfully repel part of the attack. It's actually a very complex battle. You also have to understand what the battlefield was about, which requires all that attention that we give only in the tactical reconstruction series, so to say. Nevertheless, Tagliacozzo, again, I said before, together with Markfeld, for example, if the Habsburgs became the Habsburgs, it's because of a flank attack, right? The one of Ulrich of Kapellen at the Battle of Markfeld. And that also entail, and this is also very interesting, a broader issue that you could define to be moral in nature, but that is also very connected with the idealistic literature of the time. These are battles, for example, in which there were infantrymen, but we don't see them in the battle account, even when the same source had said that in that battle there were actually the infantrymen. There's a very highly developed chivalric culture at this point. This is really the peak of feudal civilization, of universalism, of knightly power. And so we should actually make lots of different videos to delve deeper into this, to fully understand how historiography itself is influenced by this. And there is this notion that the flank attack would have been considered a cowardly tactic, which, especially in the narrative of Tagliacozzo, is connected with the unchivalric behavior, to say the least, of Charles of Anjou in the moment in which he captured, as you know, Conradin, that had actually even managed to escape Tagliacozzo, was essentially betrayed by some Roman noblemen very distant from there on to Tyrrhenian coast, and handed over to the Angevin that beheaded him on the market square of Naples, notoriously putting an end in this way to the very male blood continuity of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, with all the ideological load that would bring, we were talking about it the other day, in the clashes between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, to make the latter and their German mercenaries prominently used and motivated exactly by this phenomenon to seek revenge for what had been considered a crime, right, in international arena, in the general moral temper of the time, killing this young man that was of such noble blood, and that was really a choice of Charles more than else, and even properly of the church, that naturally had called for the same crusade against Manfred, had orchestrated the whole thing. And so there are so many different perspectives from which you can approach this. There is the final legion of an eagle flying down over the execution, touching with its claws the blood of the beheaded Hohenstaufen and bringing it back to heaven. Right, there are so many different legions, really belonging to the visionary and very beautiful, in fact, mentality of the time, that felt quite potently how times were changing, how also the great myth of the Hohenstaufen ended in this extremely dark way. That the Swabians ended all practically more or less in terrible ways, and brought to the entire, say, German power to resent this, to shrink, to fragment, to essentially withdraw even from Italy and from the Sicilian kingdom that was this personal possession because of the Hohenstaufen-Hauteville marriage. And even though the Germans would try that again later, things would not be that successful. As you know, I specialize exactly in this later part of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century. So to me, these are very... I come slightly later than Tagliacozzo as in the broader timeline, but here we're talking just 10 years before Markfeld, for example. And one thing that struck me is that among the fallen, in the German army, you find a guy from southern Italy, with a title of a locality from the Sicilian kingdom, that may have actually been one of those, not just Germans, but Italians that after the Angevin takeover had escaped to Germany and were fighting at that point against Ottokar II of Bohemia, that, as you know, was allied to Charles of Anjou. And later on, of course, with the expedition of Henry VII, you see still the Luxembourg saying pretty straight, which to the Pope that was trying to sort of mediate at that point, also double gaming. We just want to go to Naples and behead King Robert. Like, that's because of what happened back in the day at Tagliacozzo, essentially. And really, the German mercenaries at the time still waved the flag with the cat head of Conradin on it. Like, this event had been so striking, so clamorous, so heartfelt, right, by everyone, really. Also those that, were from the other side and had committed this, that it's really incredible to narrate. It's not that Conradin and his supporters were particularly tender-hearted, like they began to massacre some rebel noblemen as soon as they entered the Sicilian kingdom. There is a lot there as well, and that's why actually all these stories are worth being told with due calm, right? But it's important, in fact, also to talk about the war and making general sense of the event. That's why I also decided to focus a little bit more on the tactical side of the story, because it makes you reflect how critical the military instrument is, Clausewitzionally speaking, how, especially for the times in which these very kings were evidently as directly involved as knights in the clash, the political honor and reputation and accomplishments really pass through the battlefield. Knighthood, this equestrian feats, and evidently something more than just individual exploit, and especially at this point, an enhanced handling of the art of war that was becoming ever more complex, powerful, coordinated, disciplined, and that really makes you fall in love with the same nature of the flank attack, because it wasn't much like cheating. It required an extraordinary military skill. There would be a lot to tell about it, including the fact that we fundamentally see it documented virtually only when it succeeded. I'm actually aware of some circumstances where we know that a flank attack was, for example, not launched, but that a flank attack had existed and was launched. Well, we know only when it succeeded. And so this actually tells us, as I believe quite clearly, that historians would talk about it only when it did succeed, in fact. It's also worth noticing, by the way, that there was surely some, coming back on the topic of the morality of this thing, some tendency to obscure the flank attack per se. For example, in the official Angevin historiography, talking about Tagliacozzo, you do not find the mention of this attack. This is true in part also for some for the official column of official sources of the Battle of Markfeld for Rudolf of Habsburg, except, and that's a huge lesson, the only source written by a knight, the Steirische Reimchronik, by at least a son of a ministerialis that had also participated to the battle. I mean, not him, his father, his relatives, actually say it clearly and limpidly. And so we actually believe that aside from the dominant, especially at this point, Dominican historiography, especially among the Welfs, actually saying Rudolf of Habsburg at that point, albeit Ghibelline was not just supporting Dominican orders, but at that point was allied with the papacy, that in these 10 years had realized that calling the Angevins wasn't this better deal than having the Hohenstaufen in the south. It was just slightly better, but now the saying French had become too powerful. And that makes us, in fact, reconsider probably the what today we would call the mainstream opinion, especially among those who made war about this kind of attack, that instead was apparently something worth being celebrated, like in that source. So did this clever plan and made a video about the ambush in general. This is a form of ambush if you want. And the concept can be quite fluid depending on the wall system, right? But it obviously has the purpose of tricking the enemy and catch them by surprise. It's been used successfully many times in history. We have seen it also in the Formkriege, how to carry it out. And the most difficult thing about it all is not being discovered, which we also never hear of as well, curiously enough. It was about hiding, in this case, by the way, of Tagliacozzo, a consistent amount of troops. More frequently, instead, they were much less, right? Also because a flank attack doesn't have to be big to be successful. It has to mostly be surgical. It has to be led by a very skilled commander, but it doesn't even require a particular order of the formation. Sometimes it depends. We've seen it in the Strategicon, for example. Like it says, if there is no time, you can also rush. A flank attack is still psychologically devastating for obvious reasons. But especially at this point, when knighthood, heavy cavalry was so performing, of course, there would be some literal piercing through the enemy line from the rear, as they were, of course, engaged into combat with the other ones, and that was the point of finding the right moment to do so, and making it entirely collapse. And the reason why at Tagliacozzo the French were actually more, the French also part of their Italian, the Guelph Italian were the Tuscans, that was very split again. The Guelph-Ghibelline clash was gaining steam from the peninsula itself. Is that likely, like they, as it happened, in fact, as they attacked, the even scattered enemy had some capacity of regrouping and counterattacking. So we will see this again in the tactical reconstruction of the battle in another video, but just for telling you how complicated things actually are. Unfortunately, we do not know everything we would like, but we also have to picture all the possibilities to explain the battle properly. In the 13th century, this clash between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, in many ways affecting the Kingdom of Sicily as well, had witnessed the development of such tactics, especially the Italian communes that had had their own share of course, of equestrian feats, but had up to this point not participated to the enlargement of the formation of a regional kind of power, because they were all city-states, even though they had literal tens of thousands of troops, sometimes for an entire city and her allies, had not yet participated in the big feudal clashes that could occur in the plains of France or Central Europe. And actually, Benevent and Tagliacozzo were incredibly important schools for them. You see, for example, this experience matured at the Battle of Campaldino, where the flank attack was very well performed. It became a great feature of Italian warfare in the following generations. Also, in this case, they had always practiced it locally, just this bigger, you can't say at this point properly, during the death of universalism or the dawn of it, a nation-scale engagement was occurring. So there is literally a new way of making war. The 13th century witnesses a great increase in professionalism, in discipline, and sort of these collective achievements, combined arms. And so these cultures we're illustrating here, the French, the Germans, the Italians, but also the Spanish. You'll see the Castilians were the ones who broke through the line of Henri de Cousans, because they had also sort of a bit Swabian blood, the Sicilians, you name them. We're really developing an unprecedented level in the development of the art of war. The first battle in the 13th century, we can't say that witnesses a very well coordinated flank attack of this kind is Muret, by Simon de Montfort, who also kills the King of Aragon. If you go back to the Battle of Legnano, that there wasn't really a flank, say a pre-arranged flank attack, but basically the Brescian cavalry arrived on the battlefield as the Barbarossa line was involved in the clash against the surviving Lombard infantry, and they attack from the flank, and that causes the collapse of the German army. The German cause, say, Europe and Mediterranean wide. So it is extremely interesting to study this kind of thing. It's not just a tactical thing. Sometimes it's also strategical, meaning that there are events, also in English history, for example, where of the same years in which you have an entire army appearing suddenly by surprise from a direction that the other army did not know was coming from. It that's more like that's even a bigger deal in many ways, but it's also rarer because it's more difficult to conceal. Like a reserve, you can imagine an entire army. So this is a topic we will address along the way, because I actually inserted another branch in the cycle that talks exactly about this, say, from the 8th to the 14th century tactics as a whole, but also in depth, in very much thematic depth. We also have to talk the times, the broader political meaning, the protagonists of this battle. And of course we have to talk about Charles of Anjou, that I know many of my self-styled Ghibelline followers do not love for obvious reasons. I made a video about him back in the day as a general introduction to, in fact, his life and times. So if you are interested in a more detailed profile on the peer of France, the brother of the same Louis IX, you can check that out. Charles of Anjou was very different from his brother. His brother was sort of more of a mystical, introverted, more sensitive individual, even though he was a hell of a knight, had an extreme courage and so on. So it was really also it was considered to be extremely wise, juridically competent. Charles was really born under a different star. He was the typically springing, energetic, and in this sense, unstoppable individual. Like, he thought of himself with this enormous ambition that was reflected indeed by his political skill. Right, Louis was more like the chivalric guy. Charles was more like the iron-fisted one, and definitely the Battle of Tagliacozzo and its aftermath dramatically showed this. However, he's also a very interesting figure, right? Aside from whatever political factionalism you want to engage in, just know that we're talking history. He was a hell of a ruler and one of the most successful in the Middle Ages, so you must understand what he did, how, why, and more. In 1252, Pope Innocent IV tried to get Charles involved into the ongoing European conflict between the papacy and the German Hohenstaufen family, which had divided Italy into Welfs and Ghibellines. At that time, these terms were mainly used in Tuscany, but they help to understand the two sides. The Welfs were against the empire and supported the Pope in a general sense, but they weren't really, say, denying the empire or anything. Well, the Ghibellines were supporting the Hohenstaufen, and so they incarnated the more consistently imperial direction. One underestimated aspect of this all is, of course, the fact that even the Lombard League, those who had been fighting against Frederick I, Frederick II, were not considering themselves anti-imperials. Actually, they were proud imperial subjects and were fighting essentially for their own liberty and rights within the empire as imperial subjects. So the failure of the empire on longer run has to be imputed to, of course, the cyclopic, gigantic, yet failed effort to curb this papal resistance that was coming also from a position of definitive awareness regarding what, for example, had happened in the Byzantine Empire, which the church had been kept into subjection, sclerotizing the entire system, thanks to the investiture controversy, Western civilization boomed in fame, wealth, and power in the cosmic metaphysics of mankind. And in fact, this is the true meaning of traditional power. It's not like a static order in which nothing really happens. There are no forces, autonomies are sclerotized. On the contrary, it's the constant iron arm between a system that is so grappled within this conflict that is, however, still seeing the papacy and the empire backing each other regularly, also because they were legitimizing one another in that sense, actually compacting dramatically the system. That's again why the Byzantine Empire went a completely different course, and definitely not for the better, as especially 13th century history really shows here. There is not just the point of, if you are truly God, like, why don't you win, which should put an end to any kind of complaint in this sense, but should also point it out that while the Ghibellines definitely stuck to a traditional, fairly neatly outlined traditional doctrine, it would be very interesting to study in the merit of that, in fact, ambiguity regarding the very sources and documentation for the same. But it's evidently out there, because that's how naturally traditional the world had remained up to that point. The wealth ideology did not really exist. It was not a counter-alter to the imperial authority, if not, as, of course, the papacy intended, as some check and balance on a power that by wanting to be, in fact, the same divine one on earth by at least imperial achievement, had to be provoked in that sense. Look, are you really? Because one thing is styling yourself as such, one thing is actually being able to achieve that or not. It's something that, again, no other civilization at this point had, and that, in fact, conferred the West instead a massive edge on all the others. In many ways, the Welfs were as traditional most of the times as the Ghibellines, as a matter of fact. It wasn't just a lot of political contingency regarding these alignments. We're just talking about it the other day for Dante. It was namely a white Guelph, but that was actually just a Florentine's internal division, because, the Ghibellines had been just another type of regime and class that before these other groups had not wanted. Also because it would have entailed like a harsher Germanic imperial control, and that these people were able to, in fact, to defeat in arms, thanks also to the same Angevins. But there wasn't really, like, again, a doctrine to stick to. They weren't making proselytism regarding like a parallel idea of what the world had to be ruled like. Right? What the church claimed by itself also was very much either the reflection of an actual temporal power that this earthly power did have, next to of course, the divine connection that every man has, but it was also not particularly bought by the Welfs. There wasn't much of a, for example, even, now we have to be in love with the French because they are actually the anti-Germans, the anti-empire. There wasn't any of that, right? So don't think that the mystical fascists that wrote about these topics are very informed about the actual historical reality of these worlds. Like, they want just to provide the archetype and the counter-archetype that in many cases is actually a dualistic heresy. It should be the archetype and the absence of that, which actually describes much better, in fact, the struggle between the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, respectively, on the basis of such ideological notions. For not talking, in fact, about the same shortcomings of the empire, that had it really been, capable of achieving what it claimed to do, should have not lost. And in fact, that's how painful and bitter Tagliacozzo really is, in this realization that the Catholic world, so the universe entire, was degenerating, as step by step, by prophecy, it's, and by, in fact, historical reality ex post, has been and would, until some greater conflagration, or the the end of it all, right? So just let's be extremely aware and concrete. Like, history is not the realm in which you can project your sort of distorted fantasies about what you more or less misunderstand from, you know, authors that are saying much more nuanced things than you think, especially if you don't have a formal academic background. But it is actually, in fact, the realm where you measure how distant from the archetype things actually were and why, right? So creating myths, strange heroes, or, you know, altering very well established historical evidence, notions, and reality is not really, you know, helping you to see how, in fact, considering that this evidence, I mean, that these archetypes are Catholic, which means sacred, which means absolute, you know, it would be really distorting the same, because if history happened as it happened, and you don't understand it, and you don't want to understand it as it happened, but as you think, you're essentially committing a blasphemy, just by the idea that you can simply judge reality how you want without confronting with the actual absolute. In any case, the Pope, as we know, had offered Charles of Anjou the crown of the Kingdom of Sicily, which included all of southern Italy. This crown had previously belonged to Conrad IV of Hohenstaufen, the son of Frederick II, and King of Germany, who had been excommunicated and was therefore not fit for this position. The Pope aimed to remove imperial influence from Italy completely and weaken its supporters. However, Charles turned down the offer, mainly because his brother, Louis IX, the King of France, opposed it. Consider that here we're talking about extremely high levels. Charles is not just the Count of Anjou, that is a peer of France, but he is the County of Provence by marriage, which is also an imperial possession, by the way. There was a lot of negotiation later on still with, for example, St. Rudolph of Habsburg, to prove what we were just saying, that Guelphs and Ghibellines could actually go pretty well along in many circumstances, because there is not such a clear-cut orientation other than the archetype that is not, again, reflected in the historical reality. The sense was, of course, that the Swabians had to be kept as out as possible. Of course, Conrad the Fourth presence in southern Italy could have temporarily readjusted the situation by, for example, limiting Manfred's power, given that the latter had remained in control of the country for longer, and so the contrast even between the two half brothers would have sort of created a crisis locally that the papacy could have exploited. In fact, Conrad came to Italy and died there together with, some people say that, especially the papal historiography, that the same Manfred had killed his brother. There's also the Dark Legion that he would have killed his brothers as well, but you know that's actually not true at all. But surely there were these pretty heavy and deep issues and hatred and conflicts and jealousies. In 1262, a new pope named Urban IV made the same offer again to get rid of the Hohenstaufen, and this time Charles accepted it. Since the death of Conrad IV, Sicily had been kept ruled by Manfred. That was, as you know, the natural and sort of more alike son of Frederick II. The Supermundi really liked Manfred and trusted him greatly. He was definitely a great ruler, very capable one. I made a video about Manfred as well that nobody talks about. He is one of the single most important political figures in the Middle Ages. he managed to create a massive Mediterranean dominion, to extend his hegemony on vast parts of Italy. We've seen it in the video about the Battle of Montaperti, for example, was achieved thanks also to the German knights that also, by the way, carried out their a flank attack against the Florentines and managed, in fact, to bring the Ghibelline party of Farinata degli Uberti at the head of the same Florence, de facto making Tuscany Ghibelline. And the situation would be reverted with Benevent, in fact, and finalized with Tagliacozzo. Manfred had essentially declared himself king of Sicily without permission, and even spreading in the moment the fake news that his nephew Conradin had died, so that he would have been somewhat legitimized to be crowned. So he had de facto usurped his nephew's crown as well. And among the other things, and including the wars that followed with the papacy, he had been excommunicated. The rightful heir was definitely Conradin, that however was too young. That's also why we call him like this. It was, of course, Conrad. And we will see now what his entire epopee was tragically about. It's also very interesting to see how Charles managed to put together the expedition to Sicily that was paid extensively by the Tuscan Guelphs, and so these moneylenders and early bankers that would eventually be lavishly rewarded by Charles with the subcontracting of the Sicilian grain exports for the supplying this fastly growing Tuscan centers. There were, as we were saying, in fact, Tuscan knights as well in the crusade. That was very perilous. Like the entire, for example, crossing from Provence to Rome, it was a quite delicate thing. Charles there showed what a masterful leader he really was. We can't unfortunately digress on this, but I discussed this in the video about him. This time, Louis IX did not stop his brother from taking action because of the special situation that had unfolded in Sicily. Definitely this massive and very powerful realm, in spite of all these engulfments that had started since the minority of Frederick II, or even before. I mean, there had been ups and downs, was one of the major treasures in medieval civilization, the prestige deriving from controlling it, the excellent strategic location, the massive agricultural resources, the manpower, the military potential was really what now the French were looking, after considering especially how weak at this point German power really was. Consider that the Hohenstaufen did really end in a day, but obviously Conradin being the last of the Hohenstaufen, as a rightful name, Manfred was something slightly different, had just Conradin as their last, as their hope of continuity, because Conradin could have simply stayed in Germany and even surviving and becoming king and more, who knows what would have happened. However, the general attitude towards in fact, the Sicilian legacy was very much of a personal deal, especially for the Hohenstaufen that rightfully considered it as their, in fact, legitimate legacy. For the French that were booming at this point under Louis IX, France reaches the most splendid peak of greatness, right? Philip IV, his grandson, France was even much bigger, more powerful, but there is already like the moment of gradual stagnation and initial crisis. In any case, there is this famous meeting later on between at that point the young Philip IV and the now old Rudolf of Habsburg on the French-German border. That really signified like that point the immensity, the de facto Catholic empire that France had become, and the sort of regional, if not provincial, German power of the Habsburgs, while in fact Central Europe had been heavily destructuring in terms of public authority, privatizing, and more. We will talk more about this stuff because especially late 13th century German history is very underrated in my opinion. It's that extremely important. Charles of Anjou thus moves with an army of 30,000 men. Also for people who said, oh, but medieval armies were small. No, they weren't small. These were the actual like normal regional scale type of armies, especially at this point, the peak of medieval civilization, that by scale could be put together. Even if you count just 20,000, still in migration era, a Romano-Germanic kingdom could put it together. It's not such a strange thing. In any case, consider also the peak, as we were saying before, of knightly quality, of also the important infantry contribution, the general standards and discipline of this army, both individually and collectively, the latter more importantly, funded by, at this point, another pope, Clement IV, as we've seen also thanks to other wealth funding. As Charles traveled through Italy, he worked to defeat the Ghibelline forces he encountered. On February the 26th, 1266, he famously fought and killed Manfred at Benevent, taking control of the entire kingdom of Sicily. The Vespers, as you know, happened later, almost 20 years. There was a time in which, of course, the Angevins controlled the entirety of southern Italy, of Sicily, and all essentially the dependencies. There was a great deal of influence on Sardinia, on Tunisia, and on the Balkans as well, that would also continue on. It is really a great moment of expansion. I will skip here all the problems of controlling southern Italy. We talked about that in other videos, also about the Aragonese, etc. Definitely this country was getting destructured from itself from the peaks of Norman Swabian glory that had created, in fact, the most centralized of the Latin Germanic kingdom. It was more powerful than the Kingdom of England itself, but all these wars had been deteriorating that, and the local barons were the de facto holders of concrete power. The Angevins would install themselves in Naples. That was, in fact, not the old court of Palermo. Apulia also in the later Swabian era had become more important to begin with, for the Hohenstaufen. However, Naples was also not just an important port, but also closer to Rome, and so well located. Lots of important things to discuss that we can't in a single video, especially because of the bigger deal of this whole, right? The fact that not just the situation was not fully settled, because no power at this point was fully stable on its legs, especially after these wars, these issues internally that had been back and forth, fears of rebellion, of intervention, etc. However, Charles had, after Benevent, another huge battle again. Study this period and these regions if you want to see how big and powerful and incredible medieval armies actually were. Charles really takes control of the Mezzogiorno. The bigger deal is this, in fact, unique figure event in Western history. The young Conradin, born in 1252, who did not plan to sit idly by. He had lived in Augsburg, Bavaria, since he was 2 years old. Today, in fact, it's the Bavarian part of actually Swabia, right? And here the intertwinement is his family background, because as we've seen, his father Conrad IV king of Germany and king of the Romans, by the way, had died of illness while he was campaigning in southern Italy against the papacy. Conradin was protected now by his uncle Ludwig of Wittelsbach, that would actually be the father of Ludwig the Bavarian, Ludwig IV of the Holy Roman Empire. So we're talking about this close of a connection. And with his own mother, in fact the same Wittelsbach, the sister of Ludwig, Elizabeth. Elizabeth had remarried after Conrad's death with Meinhard of Gorizia, Görlitz. We should make a video about the County of Gorizia because it's one of the very interesting players across the Alps between Germany and Italy. You know, this policy is very, very fascinating. Many exiles from Italy that we were mentioning before, including some who escaped after Manfred's defeat, came to the young Conrad asking him to take action and promising support from pro-imperial groups in Italy. One important supporter was Galvano Lancia, a former ally and likely relative of Manfred, who became Conradin's main advisor. Galvano had been the Prince of Taranto. He was likely nephew ex-fratre of Manfred of Sicily. And together they formed this sort of government in exile. You can imagine now that the Angevins had taken over southern Italy, so lots of these vassals, of soldiers, of previous subjects had escaped, right, not to suffer the repercussions of that. And of course they would gather through this feudal dynastic recognition at the court of Conradin, that thus, of his uncle, that had a lot of course, of interest in becoming a point of reference for all these people. And we're talking, in fact, here, again, we see the Prince of Taranto, we're talking lots of knights, a lot of people that were ready to fight, right? And in fact, planning to run the kingdom based on local support as Frederick II had done before. And to fund his expedition, Conradin, that was an incredibly self-aware and courageous young man, sold some of his belongings to his own uncle Ludwig, who wasn't willing to help him financially without something in return, which showed he didn't fully trust him despite being like a father to him. This also makes sense because it was a huge deal. I mean, the condition of Germany at this point was not such for which it was extremely easy to simply put things back together, organize an Italian expedition. I mean, not even Rudolf of Habsburg after Markfeld would succeed. He thought about it thrice, 4 times, but he couldn't simply descend. It costs an enormous lot. You have to organize an incredibly large amount of things. You have to take so many connections. It takes such a long time if there is not such a strong will. Also considering that Conradin is quite young, so doesn't have all the charisma and authority required to simply lead himself the expedition. It can be very challenging. But of course Conradin bore the blood and the entire rights and legitimacy of the Hohenstaufen, of the great Swabian imperial house. And so this was unescapably his destiny to pursue, right? Like all the great Germanic heroes that on the same typical note, however, end, say, in pretty terrible ways because of some original sin of mankind. At that time, Conradin had, in fact, very few soldiers, about 1,000, including Bavarians, Swabians, and Franconians led by Marshal Krupp von Flüglingen. He hoped to have more join him once he got to Italy, of course, as it normally happened. There were lots of Ghibellines ready to take up arms. As we were telling just the other day, speaking of the Angevin peace that was sort of fully affirmed, in fact, after Tagliacozzo, but already in part after Benevent, the Guelph hegemony had really spread across central and northern Italy. There were this massive engine of communal civilization pumping blood all across Europe, and that in fact the Angevins couldn't simply control, like not even Manfred in a direct sense, but that could be somehow hegemonized. I mean, the Hohenstaufen themselves had bled themselves white to curb the Lombards, to try to establish some more, and also with very harsh and brutal means, like a more concentrated power, but things had failed. Yet we are still in 1266. There is still actually a very strong feudal component. There is a sense of, Ghibelline faith and obedience to the rightful emperor. These aspects really matter. Many do see Conradin or any other leader that could simply restore imperial authority, actually also a way to regain lost power and prestige to be co-opted, especially, again, the feudal element was looking up to the emperor just for the obvious hierarchical or organism that he could have restored at that point. For example, the monastic military orders. Those had been very, very, very much tied to Frederick II, for example. Not just, of course, the Teutonic Knights that also had some sort of greater fortune on their own, especially the Levantine, the Outremer orders. Made a video about the Battle of Acre, the Siege of Acre, 1291. That really tells you how much they were hanging on. And, of course, the demise of the Hohenstaufen was a tragedy to them in a moment of national monarchic rising. Look at what happened to the Templars under the same nephew of Charles of Anjou. The world was changing, and so it seems as if Conradin had been the only hope for this great age of order and metaphysical power to be restored with all the grandiosity of the Roman Empire. This was deeply felt and believed, to an extent really in the 13th century is difficult to express because it's the moment of greatest blend, medieval time, between tradition and, let's say, this modernity. Its intersections, its confusion, but also its organic unfolding are really within these pages. When Pope Clement IV heard about the expedition, he quickly excommunicated Conradin, the last member of the Hohenstaufen family who hadn't been condemned by the church. I will not list the end of all the other Hohenstaufen, from Heinz in his Bolognese prison after his capture in battle, the same Henry VII, his rebellion against Frederick, his father, who killed himself apparently in Calabria, Manfred butchered at Benevent, Frederick II dying in a moment in which things could have still been recovered, but that signified his ultimate failure. I mean, but this is a sort of curse. Think about Frederick Barbarossa drowning in the river Salif in Anatolia. Think about Henry VI, premature death in Messina. We were talking about it the other day for the ministeriales of Eichstätt that were present at the demise of the sovereign. So there is this chance, this lingering hope, and of redemption, of rebooting of the Apollonian cycle, that also the very Uranian-looking Conradin incarnated. Apparently he was very beautiful. He was like this sort of symbol, this prototype of Germanic biology, if you want, into expressing at best that mission, that mandate, that right to rule, and so the most promising omen on this, in spite of all odds. Right, he was opposed he was opposed not just by the papacy and such other great contendants, but also discouraged by his uncle, by his adoptive father, also his mother, that was proud of him. You can imagine, poor woman, you know the story, like she eventually went over to Charles of Anjou during her son's prison to begging him to spare his life. That was to no avail. So we're talking about an incredibly disturbing and dramatic and tragic reality. In any case, this is like how great figures cope with it all, how they also go, how they leave their mark in history, and how their legend never dies, really, because of it. Conradin, in fact, in spite of all odds, came dramatically close to making it. This is also a thing that pains you the most. He was, first of all, very determined to get his Sicilian kingdom back and ignored the Pope's actions. He marched from Bavaria to Rome, hoping to gather support for his army along the way, and eventually fighting Charles. The expedition started in Augsburg on September the 8th, 1267, and reached Verona in northeastern Italy by October the 21st. The city was very important because, it's on the Adige River. It's just the main center after the crossing the Brenner Pass, where you can sort of gather the army, getting this context across northern Italy that would in fact provide with such support. Verona itself had in the past also opposed the emperors, but even Italy at that point, the local Ghibellines had allowed for this to happen. We are on October 21st, 1267. In Verona, Conradin's friend Frederick I of Baden, who was older than him, held a noble title, by the way. The Frederick of Baden was Conradin's great, I would say, youth friend. If he just lived his youth. There is also in northeastern Italy a meeting with the same Rudolf of Habsburg that is reaching Conradin to receive instructions on how to manage Swabia. That would, as you know, be largely controlled by the Habsburgs, also especially after Conradin's demise, but had already received a quite substantial amount of power there. That's an important moment in the history of Swabia. Made a video about the region, and this is a moment in which many routes are being opened. The Swiss also start getting the Swiss communes richer, and the Habsburgs are looking east, are looking Austria, where Ottokar II is doing interesting things, is yet to happen. However, these are all the prodromes for all that story. Conradin's uncle Ludwig and stepfather Meinhard had followed Conradin up to Verona, where they actually abandoned him, advising him to go back to Germany instead, because according to them, there was not enough support to be gained in Italy. In fact, the situation in the peninsula looked worse for Conradin than it had been in Bavaria. In the Lombard cities, only Pavia supported the Hohenstaufen cause, and the Pope refused to change his support for Charles or lift the excommunication. Of course, as the new year began, Conradin's expedition moved from Verona to Pisa, that was also a traditionally Ghibelline city, where he received in fact, more troops and money. Rich maritime republic, but also with a pretty sound terrestrial backbone. Pisa had been helping the Hohenstaufen in its past, not always, but of course, because of most of what she could get, and of course, the Pisan presence in the southern Italian ports was on the table. Had Conradin won in this situation, was the great rivalry between the Genoese and the Pisans. This is before the Meloria, by the way, so the odds were pretty balanced. The sea was very important. In February, some Saracen soldiers from the time of Frederick II rebelled against Charles of Anjou in Lucera, northern Apulia, which surely was connected, of course, with Conradin's coming. You know who these people were. These were some Muslims of Sicily that had been deported to this old Roman city, the key of the Apulia, as it was called, that in fact dominated with an important castle is still visible from Swabian Angevin times. The surrounding town and territory, this had previously been brigands of sort that Frederick had violently subjected, disemboweling their leader in front of them with his spear, and tying, of course, them to him like his dogs, because at that point he could have simply massacred them entirely, and instead so they devoted themselves to him. He extirpated them from Sicily, and he grafted them in this more strategically relevant place where it would be more useful, and the Saracens, in fact, would be an important military component of the Stupor Mundis armies, also in northern Italy against the Lombard League and so on. Nothing special, they were mostly lighter troops, but they were also, pioneers, military, engineers, technicians of sort. We'll talk about the Saracens of Lucera specifically. You can check here and there. I recently made also a video about the southern Italian and Sicilian warfare in which we discussed them. And this was a great issue because they were actually a relevant military component, right? They were to be counted in, like as a community, likely in the tens of thousands. That's all they were, essentially the last Muslim presence in southern Italy, and surely several thousand were expendable for their military skills. Their rebellion was really a problem. This meant that Charles would be, by the way, too busy dealing with them to stop Conradin from reaching Rome, which was yet another major symbolical step, of course. In the spring, 1268, Conradin crossed through Tuscany and entered areas controlled by the Pope, showing off his troops near Viterbo, essentially passing along the road down the city where the Pope lived. And the Pope observed Conradin's army passing by. He was not scared by that. Also, the papacy was very self-aware about their power, and they knew that the Angevins were on the other side to confront the Ghibellines. Finally, on July the 24th, Conradin arrived in Rome. And just imagine that. Like, if you go to Rome and think that Conradin, I mean, among all the great figures you should rightfully imagine in all the various locations, just know that, yes, Conradin was on the Palatine Hill, that Conradin passed under Constantine Arc, that, that sense of Romanity, of rejuvenation, of actual control of the city, right? We talked about the Roman issues in the past, like Rome was an incredibly turbulent city. The same papacy had problems still at this point to control it. In this case, of course, the Ghibellines opened the gates of the city. Rome has an incredibly rich medieval history that people do not seem to acknowledge as still, of course, the cosmic centrality of mankind, and anything that can can mean, right? Outside of Rome, there is no God, there has never been, and that's the only place that matters fundamentally in the history of the world. The Romans welcomed Conradin warmly, but the noblemen, who mainly, not all of them, however, supported the Pope and Charles, were not excited. There were lots of reasons why this was the case, was happening. Nevertheless, we don't have time, unfortunately, also here to digress on it. The rebellion of the Saracens in Lucera surely gave Conradin an idea. In fact, he decided to focus on the city to free the soldiers trapped there, which would force Charles to fight him. Some Saracen soldiers had joined his army, making this plan potentially very helpful. The quickest way to get there would have been the Via Latina, the Latin road, going through Campania. But that route had been blocked by the Angevins. So the only other option was the Via Valeria, which went from Tivoli into the Abruzzo Mountains. That is a hell of a terrain. As you know, pretty primitive, brutal place. Lots of different valleys, fortifications. It's actually a pretty dangerous area. I'm preparing actually a video about the medieval Abruzzi, and there is actually a lot about that region. I don't know why people don't talk about it more often. It's so very rich and very medieval, very sort of, hardcore Italic stock. And Conradin left Rome on August the 18th, knowing his mission was now very important. Imagine an emperor that has achieved its own imperium, in fact, in controlling Rome, and now being sent to vanquish the greater enemy awaiting for him. Meanwhile, Charles was also busy. He had a strong network of spies in Rome who kept him informed about Conradin's plans. This helped him reach Abruzzo by early August, anticipating thus his adversary. In the rough terrain of the Apennines, Charles could easily find a good place to fight, even though he had slightly fewer soldiers. Conradin had about 4,500 knights, while he had around 4,000. Charles wanted, of course, a big victory to get rid of any threats to his kingdom for good. This was going to be hard because of the differences in their forces. Helping him was Allard of Valery, a close friend of the French royal family who had just come back from fighting in the Holy Land. He was experienced in many battles and helped Charles make a plan that would decide the future of his kingdom. We will look at the battle tactics also in this video, later though, in slightly more depth. If you're interested in what that kind of Levantine experience Allard of Valery may have had, I made a video about Mamluk tactics. Mamluks are the same ones that in a few decades will finish off the Crusader outposts for good on, in fact, the Levantine coast. There was a lot of skirmishing throughout this period. The situation was pretty dire. But as we were pointing out before, it was just the time to be mature for this kind of tactics in such big Western armies. Everything made sense. This was not the first time the Westerners employed this tactic, also by people, as we've seen, that had not previously participated to the Outremer expeditions and fought against the Turks. So we are told, of course, by the sources of Allard of Valery's episodes, we can't simply dismiss it as saying, it was not important. It was important, right? Surely there was some connection with those Eastern tactics, with Allard's knightly experience, but this came completely all together, all intertwined. Like, you can't gnostically separate them from one another. It's because of this reason that they decided to employ the tactics. Or no, right? It was just a very good idea. That was definitely also not the first time that anybody had a hand, especially in this massive 13th century clashes. And as you were saying before, like the French were also among those who had employed this tactic the most, but it was pretty universal in this chivalric world now, and it was just yet another option, one surely employable also by the enemy. Of course, having the advantage of choosing the terrain was key in this story, and things could also go wrong. It wasn't just about succeeding in hiding the reserve. It a big set of factors that were surely as carefully planned in part, but in part could simply not be predictable to begin with. And that's how it really happened. Again, today we'll follow a bit of a different structure from the usual, being very concise on the battle and then criticizing certain aspects of it and its tactics. August the 23rd, 1268. This is one of those dates you do not forget. Charles and Conradin met on the plains between Magliano dei Marsi and Avezzano. Today, by the way, the A25 highway runs close to that area. The landscape is very beautiful as well. From one side it's desolated, on the other there are forests, there is green, there are these towns all around with lots of medieval vestiges, including the ones of the battle, like the Church of St. Mary of Victory that Charles had erected. In fact, next to the inserted also a little map of the battle that is quite explicative there. Of course, vowing this kind of, okay, let's get God's favor, so is all there. That I can't stress how feudally, chivalrously and equestrianly soaked this entire military culture was, right? Regardless, again, of the moral, the political implications, or whatever. We wish we knew more of this, but sometimes just looking at the places, I inserted multiple pictures of the area. It's really evocative. The two armies faced each other across a stream flowing from the Mount Velino, it's a pretty massive relief, into the Imele River. Conradin saw only two groups of cavalry in front of him, and because his forces were at least 3 to 2 stronger, as a consequence, he felt confident about winning. Essentially, there were just the two visible battle lines. Conradin noticed Charles' banners at the front of the enemy line. This, of course, was the conventional mean of recognition. Every knight had his own, but of course the Angevin, the Neapolitan, the French insignia were pretty clearly associated to Charles. And so Conradin identified him. There he thought he was ready to fight. But as we know, that was actually a trick. Which also tells you, by the way, how fanatically exceptional, by the way, these men were. I mean, the Lord Henri de Cousans, that was Charles' Marshal, was the individual actually wearing Charles' insignia to mislead Conradin. And it's not like the guy was weaseling out of the situation. Henri got himself killed to make the enemy bait completely, and thinking that he was actually Charles' corpse, just for saying, like, the fanatic devotion, the incredible, like, just undescribable level of discipline and self-sacrifice and sense of how to remember this. Because when you, again, as a 21st century person says, oh, those were Guelphs, were better, can you do what Henri de Cousans did? I doubt that you can, right? This was real. This is real. Charles himself as we know, it was instead leading. This was not really properly a hidden reserve. I mean, yes, it was hidden, and it was a reserve if you consider an entire battle line a reserve. And it's a bit novel. We're talking 800 of his finest knights hidden in the hills, and so we're talking about even the strongest line that would have, like as you see in these other battles, often also just be kept in reserve, but in the open, like as the last line, the one you want to quite straightforwardly, perpendicularly smash into the enemy line. This effect was in a sense enhanced, thanks also to the very good terrain reconnaissance that had brought to the choice of this location. We will talk about this more in depth later. So to add again the elite shock capacity with the psychological shock one, Conradin's forces crossed the aforementioned stream without any trouble from Charles' men, that thus sort of let him come, which was not quite also the proper practice. Normally they would deploy behind these streams just to charge into the enemy in the moment they crossed, because they would have been more disordered. In any case, this allowed this again, there were mostly Germans, Italians, Spanish, etc., launching this strong attack. It was actually a first battle. The large number of soldiers on Conradin's side naturally played a big role, but not only, because it was the Castilians that actually broke through. It was Henry of Castile who broke through the French line. And Charles, or rather Henri, was knocked down in this engagement. His soldiers, demoralized by losing their leader, started to retreat. That's how effective such camouflage, this impersonation, had really been. Just when it seemed like Conradin was winning, and in fact the Ghibelline troops had basically started plundering, despoiling the corpses, sort of dispersing across the plain, Charles and his hidden troops appeared and attacked the tired enemy from behind. With Ghibelline forces caught off guard, they suffered heavy losses. Conradin managed to escape with his friend Frederick of Baden. However, when they reached the Tyrrhenian coast near Anzio, they were betrayed and handed over to Charles, who executed them in Naples, the new capital of his kingdom. Conradin had sort of camouflaged himself to escape. He was, however, recognized by a Frangipanan nobleman close to Torre Astura because of the very expensive ring that he was wearing. The helmsman that was to ship them further north, like the Ghibelline port, was suspicious. He betrayed them. He handed them over to this local Roman aristocrat, who handed over to Charles. We will talk way more in depth about this, the entire, say, brutality of the story. The fact that, of course, this is really a political crime. There is much to what Conradin's execution added to the general trouble of the times and the sort of the generation of the world. However, this also enforced an incredibly successful regime in Naples. It rebalanced the entire political spectrum. There was an astonishing consequence of it all. It's difficult even to speak so easily about it, because, you know, if you talk about Bouvines, if you talk about Hastings, as we did just recently for the anniversary, you can argue that the sort of the fame of the battle was always entailing that, oh my god, this changed so much, it's such an important deal and whatever. When we talk about 13th century battles, Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, but also other ones, for example, in the Guelph-Ghibelline struggle, like Campaldino or Montecatini, like the story is, these are important battles, but we sort of don't care more than much, right? Or at least we do, but we don't know so much about it. We thus don't think how far this implication could go. As literally, I don't know, the existence of the Habsburgic Empire, for example. You can understand even just from this how relevant this whole thing is. I made multiple videos, also medieval Austria on the rise of the Habsburgs, but these are also things we have to look at in much greater detail. Of course, there are so many other events, as random as a biological coincidence that, say, a birth, a death, or any other factor leading to that, of course, changes history that much. But of course, the battle is the manifestation of that clashes, that clash of wills that manifests, materializes in the final settlement. It's the wall against wall, the moment that in itself incarnates the entire point of so many other issues compounded in this conflict that deflagrates at this point in such also massive bloodshed. These are massive battles. That's yet another thing that I will never let's say, let anybody else contest, in the sense that medieval armies had massive numbers. And it's really not true that in comparison, like, ancient battles were so much larger. Like, first of all, the documentation is so different. Many of these numbers are obviously enhanced, and they are more celebratory in a much more didascalic sense than, say, medieval chronicles that are literally telling you what was happening at the time, like a literal political story. Ancient history does not even recount you all the smaller armies that were at times also frequently mobilized in that sense. For medieval times, we have so much more, and you actually see a massive military activity, something hallucinatingly impacting. In battles like Tagliacozzo were some of the largest of the era, but again, do people even care? Do even people fixate with it? Are there, admittedly, yes, there is a general remembrance, but why? Because Dante somehow talked about this, because the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and these are the sort of the only names that you have to remember by heart. What about, like, of course, there is not like a major, museum of the battle in these areas. There isn't. There is a great awareness of, say, the cultural legacy of the historical value, but it's not like, as Westerners, we have interiorized so much, after all, how crucial this was and celebrated it accordingly. I think that especially in a time in which Europe tries in its own weird way to become a union, which we all hope, a real one, say these historical events will be reevaluated in the way they really deserve, because they are. So today I didn't get moved about this battle because we didn't observe it into the very details, but it's like even just Conradin's fate is the one of one of those Germanic heroes, right? Tragically falling because of a great story behind it. And so that's how the Hohenstaufen epopee really ended. The Battle of Tagliacozzo was also crucial in shaping Italian history. It handed not just the Swabian family's power in the region, but it dashed the hopes of their supporters. It started the rule of Charles I of Anjou in southern Italy. What if Conradin had actually won the battle? You see, the worst about this all is that he had just won. Right? If it hadn't been for the hidden reserve, that was definitely a master plan, and a very carefully executed one, he had already won the day. You can imagine a completely different Western history, of course, and we often sort of don't imagine this, and how like all the various alignments. Just even think about the future of southern Italy. Like Charles of Anjou's rule there prompted the Vespers, the Byzantine Aragonese alliance, a completely different political scenario. Just the other day, I made a 2 hours long video about the so-called Pax Angevensis, which with the Angevin peace, that would have not occurred. Would there have been a Suebica one? What would have the communes reacted like to this? How would have, say, a Conradin's generation really looked like at this point? Emperor Conrad IV, right? Conrad IV, his father, as king of Germany, king of the Romans, but let's say this new age could have started with this young ruler, about which, in fact, we know too few, because his life was cut too short, too early, in order to imagine. As you know, I don't like what-ifs very much. I like history because it's real, so I don't think it's much of a useful say exercise to think too much about that, if not in the immediate aftermath, right? Because you can immediately sort of understand more or less what have occurred. But that also puts in perspective the magnitude of this battle, and so not simply yet another battle, but of course something massive in the balance of European power. Really, just think about how deeply German history would have changed, right? Could have Conradin inherited, for example, southeastern, the Babenberg legacy, right? How would have he coped with Ottokar of the Second of Bohemia? How would the rest of the German princes reacted to this? Oh, what about the Habsburgs, right? Probably today we wouldn't even remember them as, if not of some secondary, or maybe, you know, they would have managed to form a power principality, but not like the one they eventually did. As we've seen, Charles' victory was largely due to the smart battle plan created by his skilled strategist Allard de Valéry. So we have characterized this guy. Allard was an older warrior with experience from the Crusades, and of course he wanted to ensure a strong win for his king. He knew that the Angevins were outnumbered by Conradin's forces, not an enormous divide, but there was still, especially in these pretty big forces, like some important difference. And to make up for this, he needed a clever strategy. The uneven and forested land of the Palentinian Plains gave him the chance to hide some of his troops, which could confuse the enemy about how many soldiers he really had. By the way, the true name of the battle is, we say Tagliacozzo because it's sort of the closer, sort of more relevant center out there. Actually, it's closer to a smaller town called Scurcola Marsicana. So this is the Marsica area, the region inhabited by the ancient Marsi people that apparently were also quite martial, and so it's a deep history behind this rough Apennine setting. However, the proper name of the battle, that in fact hope will have enough space to insert in the title, is the Battle of the Palentinian Plains, which is the proper name that you should give to this. And again, in another video, we will give much more precise coordinates spatially. Now, studying the land carefully was a key part of the battle plan. As we observed, the Angevins had arrived early, allowing Allard and Charles to explore this area. And so this careful preparation became essential for their victory. surprise, as we know, is a key primary element of the art of war. By hiding some of their soldiers, the Angevins hoped to catch Conradin's army off guard and defeat them completely, as it happened. And so once they found the best spot to hide their troops, they needed to trick the enemy into believing they were stronger than they really were. Allard decided to spread out his formations. In fact, Charles' reserve was pretty far away from the rest of and we tend to sort of forget this, that medieval battles extended for kilometers, and sometimes they in fact entailed very complex long maneuvers, like also the one of Charles of Anjou to enter the battle really was. Naturally, they had to be located in a place where they could see what was going on in the plains to intervene at the right moment. And so the flank attack, making the enemy vulnerable, placing him in this condition of inferiority. And that's where the sacrifice of Henri de Cousins takes place, right? This guy bravely wore insignia and challenged the enemy, leading to his death, which misled them to thinking they had already won. That was really the main feat. It's also the underrated one, how successfully capable they had been to trick the enemy into this. And Henri knew that, that his life would have actually been the likely way of success. Imagine that you're preparing for all this. You die yourself, but you're consciously not knowing whether the battle will actually be won in the end. So it's an incredible confidence, even just in the afterlife, in the broader order of nature, that your sacrifice will be rewarded. And these were true knights. These were true fighters, really. The most critical part of the plan was also the timing for revealing the hidden troops. Acting too soon could ruin the element of surprise, while waiting too long could lead to only a partial win. It was essential that the commanders in charge of the hidden troops made the right decision. In the end, when you look at the wall, like the tactic of hiding troops at the Battle of the Palentinian Plains was executed perfectly, and it caused devastating confusion among Conradin's troops. It even managed to rally at some point and to put up some resistance. So it wasn't even just per se decisive, but of course shifted the balance gradually in a very imposing way for also a very spent force. Consider this, that the troops that had crushed the Angevins had fought, they had also spread out. So chapeau to them. So their quality, their valor, for managing to partially rally, to form a line to stand the enemy. So these are great chivalric feats. We know, unfortunately, too few about the infantry, but they were there, so we should never forget about this. And just bringing, tens of thousands of men into the Abruzzo mountains is quite a strategic and logistical feat. Like, this is a place, of course, that could sustain them, but it takes quite some level of coordination, even for enacting this careful battle plan and making everything go the right way. It's really a great field to pull off. We can look a bit at the contendants here, because this video deserves to be longer, even if we're not talking about the entirety of the story in depth, which would take tens of chapters. Charles of Anjou, he was the last in line to inherit the throne, among the other things. He was born in 1226, and the fact that even as the last in line, he would, of course, bring him to want to seize the important kingdom of Sicily, which he succeeded in, tells you what kind of mentality he had. His main trait was ambition. He had a strict and disciplined life. Apparently, he was never seen smiling, laughing. This is quite interesting. It's interesting also to see how these people lived. I mean, as they were teenagers, they were already given a mini court that they also shifted wherever they went. They were incredibly rich and, let's say, spoiled in the sense of, they knew their deal. They had to be this kind of fierce fighters and risk takers. They were given immediately that capacity to administrate people and assets. Definitely during his war against Conradin, Charles showed a cold determination by also just executing his rival and his captured supporters, which takes massive guts, just to sustain, like to be responding of this in front of God, in front of Christendom, in front of political order. He was backed by the papacy, but not even the Pope was actually very happy with this world situation. Of course, there was so much at stake. I mean, if Conradin had remained alive, at some point, the issue would have represented itself. The Hohenstaufen may have, in fact, reformed at some point in that broader legacy. There were some issues concerning this eventually for the same kingdom of Sicily. I mean, the same Italian wars were in a way the continuation of the Angevin claim to the Sicilian throne. Think about the Aragonese. This was a major issue, like for, of course, the nobility of the time, for the major royal houses to prove constantly their own superiority of their opponents, and for this ferocious hatred. And here, everything was bigger because it's the great century of universalism, as we were saying before. And so here, it's not even just, of course, the massive legacy of the Hohenstaufen that Conradin could just match by his courage, not much by his, as we've seen, background in terms of expandable wealth, etc. But he managed to convince so many to fight for him and to revive this cause. This is really an exceptional figure. We will talk now also a bit better about. So Charles definitely knew how to spring out in that conquering feat, right? He managed with Tagliacozzo to build a large territory that extended from France to Italy and the Balkans, dreaming of creating a Latin empire. It's actually just the Sicilian Vespers that prevent him from achieving that. The Byzantines did not have enough forces to defend Constantinople. Charles would have retaken it and reformed the Latin Empire. At that point, so much would have actually occurred, but also in this case, it's a what-if that also shows how by the end of the 13th century, there was a broader sense of fatigue in Europe, in the Mediterranean, in the world, really. The Pax Mongolica was to end itself. Like all these great systems were gradually to be eroded. Charles died in 1285, having lost Sicily, the island of Sicily, so separating the Regnum Sicilia Ultra from the one of Citra Farum, which Farum is the accusative for the lighthouse of Messina that divided with the straits. These two chunks would remain divided until the 15th century. They would actually remain divided until the 18th century, or the 19th even, because they were formally separated vice kingdoms. All right. In any case, this the death of Charles of Anjou is, in fact, the one that he went through a lot of stuff. The capture of his son by Roger of Lauria. There were lots of issues with the Aragonese. He tried to manipulate also his nephews on the throne, Philip III. I mean, lots of things were really going on at this point between the Angevins and the Aragonese, especially. That is really insane. If you think about this, this was yet another royal house, right? Charles was just like the Count of Provence and of Anjou, but in this more independent sense, just he didn't have a kingdom until he seized the Sicilian one, and it was a huge deal, given the power of this realm, and also a way to show off this brother that, by the way, would die also in part because of the fact that Charles wouldn't give him Sicily as a place to launch the invasion of Egypt for the second time in the king's life, causing Tunisia to be the backup plan, and with the death of Saint Louis because of the plague and so on. So just think about how much changed just because of these individual choices. And this is the point. Charles' gains sort of quickly started to fall apart in a broader sense. The greater result was definitely southern Italy, Naples, what you can start calling it the continental part. That was definitely, and by far, the biggest, the most powerful element, was more important than Sicily at this point. There were lots of territories also in the Balkans. There were some Latin Empire principalities that had remained there. The Angevins interfere with, also thanks to their wealth Italian connections with the various maritime fleets and so on. There is one aspect about Charles' reign that he definitely took every chance to expand his land and used all means for his ambition, he never learned how to really manage to such a diverse group of territories, which is debatable, of course. But naturally, it was about grabbing as much as possible, and in many ways that was sort of the best policy and strategy of the time. Then how things would be kept together was an entirely different challenge that evidently also in the case of such a ruthlessly effective ruler like Charles, brought to this disgregation, partial disgregation. The Angevins remained one of the greatest powers in Europe in the following centuries. Speaking of Conradin, just think what a different background there was. You see, these rulers were united by this Sicilian legacy. They went over there to literally die, win or die. Conradin had been raised in Germany, though. He definitely had done so in the grandeur of the imperial household, but his father had died when he was just 2 years old. He spent his childhood in Bavaria. There wasn't much of that sense of enormous satisfaction, especially after the demise of Frederick II, the same Manfred, and before that Conradin's father. So everything seemed really crumbling to pieces from the German perspective as well, and it was objectively true, since the Edictum in Favorem Principum de Saint Frederick II had been obliged basically to sell out the kingdom of Germany, essentially public rights in exchange for private assets. And as we know, the interregnum basically starts with the entire balance of power being redrawn, mostly in this private basis, with the old German national monarchy essentially collapsing. Like basically all the Central European realms, right? It's just France that instead literally takes off, skyrockets. It's just a leviathan. It's an incredible scale. In the sheer magnitude of power the French monarchy displays, it's something utterly insane. And so, psychologically speaking, just from Conradin's perspective, surely was nurtured with this great sense of Germanic epos, of this impending sense of doom and the creeping darkness, the wrath, the the roots of the world, and so on, there was definitely a spring of heroism, of enormous sense of honor, of legacy, of continuity that he incarnated even in his tragic failure at perfection, because the glory, like the honor of this man was intact, right? He died the victim of a carnifex that evidently betrayed that world, that was really making another point, together with, in fact, the takeoff of a much more ruthlessly efficient civilization. I mean, the French Avignonese Guelph Neapolitan axis is by far sort of the most stately, bureaucratically, financially, and also military advance of the time. They really achieved really what the Germans hadn't been able to, which is yet another aspect that one should consider. You see, there is all this, as I was saying in the beginning, archetypal revival. The Guelphs, the Ghibellines. Now everybody's an expert about this. Most people do not really know anything about this. Someone in the comments was rightly pointing it out. There is no hype about the single most significant chapter opening up here, that is truly this Papal Guelph, Angevin, say French Neapolitan axis that really is it's Avignon, it's Tuscan art, it's the Italian Trecento, is the splendor of the Capetian monarchy. It's so much at a time that stem directly from this very event. Like, consider that at Tagliacozzo, by the time of Tagliacozzo, Dante was 3 years old. So just think how that world was informed, and how really still primitive it really was. I mean, up to the mid-13th century, the world was still magically enchanted in still that sort of traditional world that partially corresponded also to less development, to less material wealth. Very different balance from what would happen later. Real states began to affirm themselves. So the Battle of Tagliacozzo in many ways separates two worlds. In many ways, the final, let's say, cut was definitely the 40s of the 14th century. It's really the great mid-14th century crisis. At that point, Germany, as you know, sort of bails out the same. At that point, Conradin of Swabia and Ludwig of Bavaria would have bailed out of Italy after having, however, made this hit-and-run expedition to just get the Holy Roman Imperial crown, not bogging down and dying to it like Henry VII. There was, in that sense, sort of still living in the wake of the Hohenstaufen legacy, also in that sort of grim conclusion, and even theorizing the fact that, say, the German king could simply be emperor even without papal support. That those were actually the times of greater sort of ideological skirmishing of two declining universal powers. So actually things would have reinforced themselves, as you know, later. But it's really the end of the world, of a world. Also, the same Neapolitan kingdom. You can argue that it's really with King Robert, descendant of Charles of Anjou, and this great munific king that we have. I've never made a video about him. He's one of the greatest figures in medieval government. Helped greatly the Guelph cause. He fought relentlessly against the Aragonese in Sicily. That with him, with this sense of great universal power, sort of dies, and the same divide that in Italy exists between the lands north and south of the rivers Garigliano and Tronto from the Tyrrhenian and Adriatic side respectively begins. Like that sense of southern Italy remaining really like as a sort of separated cultural area in Italian history is effectively a consequence of the contraction of the great medieval civilization, of the fact that up to that point, as the same as Normans and Swabians had proven, you could create other countries, other kingdoms. You could really toy with these old great possessions in a universal fashion. After that, there is the reinforcement essentially of a regional power, a local, ever more defined, ever more separated from the others kind of context. That is really what happens at the end of all the great phases of expansions normally. Also, the bigger powers are the ones that consolidate the most, and often, in fact, yes, there are some powers that emerge in the meanwhile, but it's not like they're going to have much of a traction, even at the decline of the bigger ones, because the crisis invests everyone, and actually the smaller powers have less capacities to withstand the generalized crisis. And we are living in a very similar time after all. So civilization is not an option. The countries that survive better crises are definitely civilized ones, but then maybe much later, for some reason, one country rises again, but it's not at the moment. The history of civilization, the great collapses invest everybody, and even more harshly those that are underdeveloped, those are in the fringe, in the periphery. We do not know much about Conradin. We know he received a good education. He could speak Latin, which is also very important for a would-be Roman ruler. He was handsome, as we said. He seemed very determined, but we can't really say at only 16 what he would have been like as a leader, unfortunately. Surely he faced the experienced Charles of Anjou in battle, which was a massive feat just by his age, so this placed him definitely in a very special spot. I'd say this person was really, he was broken by his defeat, in the sense he was also killed, but as we've seen, he had managed to do this. He actually led most of the campaign on his own, as his family left him to return to Germany. Right, naturally, he was assisted by other more mature individuals, but the bravery, especially the independence that he showed, are really, really remarkable. What a great ruler he might have been. It's hard to say, of course, how much his lack of experience affected, for example, the Battlespur result, which was his first and last as well to assess in a strictly military historical sense. But as we pointed out at the beginning, you can't quite simply say, okay, these were incapable because there was a concealed reserve they had not noticed, right? It's a complex issue. There is, again, much to write about it, but it happens as well, and there are also countermeasures that can be enacted. There are some precautions that evidently here were not taken specifically. And yes, the Angevins were better than them. There was also greater heterogeneity of his force, right? The group Conradin commanded was very varied and needed strong leadership that Conradin, because of his young age, may not have had to begin with. A last reflection, of course, I could make a general one on how, of course, the Palentinian Plains host this theatrically splendid as tragic finale of the great Hohenstaufen epopee. We should talk more about them and about this, especially the traditional meaning of that. However, it's also important to acknowledge how this was yet one of the great battles of the era. And so when we look at the tactics from the East or this flanking tactics, you have to appreciate also the universal, sort of the general approach to the same. Surely many soldiers learned important lessons from their defeats, by the way, against Islamic armies during the Crusades. There is, however, we pointed out very often, a general notion, in fact, that these tactics would have been so special because, flank attacks, concealed reserves, ambushes, whatever, hit and run tactics, feint flights. All right, but then, because we know that in certain major engagements, like the Westerns did not really have much to be told by Islamic forces. On the contrary, like the open field upper hand, on average, was from the Western side. And so, as a whole, surely there was a more flexible approach that could help the Muslims in there by exploiting any mistake made by European forces, if these were in fact heavier and more shocking, more sort of frontally impacting in conception. And given that the Angevins were at least inferior in number at the Palentinian Plains, it is possible that, of course, in order to balance that gap, the flank reserve was actually employed in that way. We will see all this in greater detail to objectivize the situation, because very often we act, I see in here this context, this guy failed, and this other, was therefore, more intelligent, right? This is not really how you should look at medieval warfare. Things were much more balanced. Surely, what stands out at Tagliacozzo, though, is that there were only 2 battle lines that the Angevins showed, which could have spread some suspicion. The battle was closely fought at that point as well, so that also shows that it's not like the Ghibellines could simply feel like they could not spend all their forces given this opportunity, especially considering that they thought they were fighting against the St. Charles because of his insignia well inside. This fact of the insignia was really important because apparently some later figures even refused to, some Germans, I don't want to spoil this, but I'm writing an article about this, wouldn't want to retreat to withdraw at least to a more favorable location during a specific battle at the beginning of the early 14th century, because the enemy had spotted his insignia, which also likely contained the ones of the empire, and they were Angevins they were facing. So also in that, for example, the idea of the stubbornness sometimes that a certain military culture can provide is a double-edged sword. It's not necessarily a negative thing. Surely Charles' reserve was massive. It's not the typical reserve you see in these other battles. So in a way, you can say that at least the Angevins were better in handling, right, that specific circumstance than the quality of these forces, the interest of the various troops. The composition is very debatable. They were all pretty similar to one another. It was a great knightly battle in which everybody knew how to beat one another in this extremely... It was become really a very heavy, technical, and punching fashion. It's very interesting to document. Also, the Battle of Benevent brings a bit about the stereotype, which is just a stereotype of the Germans that would have been heavier, right? The fact that, for example, plate armor had spread the earliest in Western Europe from, say, the Frankish world, from the Elbe, right, from the German-Mongol frontier, essentially. But it also spread homogeneously all over Europe in the same years. In Germany, just the first place where we see it. The Great Helm, so this sense of greater robustness of the Germans, stereotype. And as a consequence, it said the French needing to develop some lighter type of cavalry that could exploit the German weakness, and using stocks and lighter chapelle de fer to grapple with the enemies almost in a wrestling style fashion, and sticking these daggers into the armpits that were not protected by plate armor. Actually, all these troops were the same. If you take again the French, the Germans, the Italians, the Spanish, they fought in the same identical way. Especially, really, this heavy component was the backbone of Western armies at the time. Right? You can only think maybe of the Spanish having some sort of more a la Jineta kind of flavor, but the troops that were the Spanish troops at Tagliacozzo were pretty much like all the others. Also, we don't have excessive details, so it doesn't make any sense to categorize. Battles are won thanks to these maneuvers, these tactics, these general plans, and leadership, morale, and so many other things. Unfortunately, we can't simply measure here. So again, we will make another video about the tactical analysis of Tagliacozzo. It's somehow complex, right? It's not that easy. So it is stereotypically possible that the French were looking towards something more definitive to get it over with. But the question is also, why wouldn't the Ghibellines do so? And also, like, the French were developing also some of the heaviest. And they actually had, up to that point, like the best cavalry around. The Germans were contending with them. Actually, there was this idea that from this moment onwards, the Germans, paradoxically, when their state exploded, like, sent out all these mercenaries that were much more, if anything, motivated and so performing than the French, which would be evident later on also in Italy, with especially after Henry VII expedition, when lots of Germans stayed there and they fought against this, in fact, Neapolitans, the Angevins that were fighting together alongside the Guelphs, right? We will really talk about this all. So it is fair to say that surely the Western soldiers returning from crusades like L'Arc de Valerie would have an interesting military experience, but it didn't mean they had to fight like the Turks. This was not only due to the challenges of sharing knowledge, which is also debatable because these guys were trained to do technically a lot, right? It's not like they had to learn from the Turks, even this type of tactics. But also because, in fact, some tactics only worked in their original situations and, in fact, original milieu and backbones, right? There was nothing inherently wrong in Western tactics against the Islamic foes. If anything, they showed that they had the upper hand over them. So the flank attack is just as typically Western as a tactic than you can find in the East. It's just a perspective distortion due to the levels of documentation, the more frontal type of, and in fact strong, more impacting force the Western armies could feel, and these battles really shown it to an important degree. Of course, without the resistance of the two Angevin battle lines in engagement, Charles of Anjou could have not won simply with the hidden reserve, right? But there is also no doubt that the Crusades greatly influenced Western military strategies to a broader degree. At least they were an important school, an important battleground. They challenged, in a sense, the same feudal military system, which was used to shorter fights, for example. Now soldiers found themselves in long campaigns lasting at least a year, far from their homes. So there was definitely some wisdom. There is definitely some truth behind the various layers of this reference to L'Arc de Valerie. These were all, again, former crusaders, monastic knights. This is true also for other individuals like, I don't know, Roger de Flor. They belong to this very variegated world that we described here and there in our videos about the Templars, the Hospitallers, etc. Now, the foreign land and harsh weather to help changing one's mind. Unified command was hard due to the feudal system. There were huge logistical challenges in managing campaigns and keeping in touch with home. So despite these difficulties, the Crusades happened and pushed Europe to find solutions to problems that initially seemed, if not impossible, at least not really needed to be practiced. So the experience gained there taught the Crusaders to make, if anything, the most out of their resources. And so this led to also to, in parallel to, of course, what was happening in Europe, that was quite intense and definitely way more important what was happening actually in the very Crusades, to the development of more organized military system, thanks especially to religious orders and say monastic chivalric ones like the Templars, who made their own rules for this purpose. The Templar statutes are one of the most underrated sources for the description of 13th century, like the peak of knightly warfare, really. And of course, Islam also learned some lessons from the West. The success of the Crusades was partly due to the strong Christian fleets, for example, were mostly Italian, and the Italians were there before and after the Crusades. And so without them, the Crusades may have not happened, at least in the way they did. Right? The Ottomans would later, like when they evolved from, their armies of Ghazis, Mordiers, into something more consistent, would build a strong navy as part of their expansion, not just being pirates anymore. And there would be a lot really to say about this, because people like the Crusades, but they sort of mimify them as most history, I would say. So they tend to simply say, okay, so since an historiography said that, oh my god, the Crusade tactics were so complex and complicated, must have changed everything. No, right? It's a very interesting, of course, context where lots of changes occurred, but not in the general sense that you can pick Western civilization by scale at this point of radically intense warfare throughout all these centuries and simply say, well, the Crusades changed it all. Not really. They, if anything, refined the pretty solid backbone that was already developing on its own. This is a chapter we'll have to discuss in other videos about the Crusades. What I like about Schwerpunkt, the way I came to, in part even accidentally organize it, is how we are adding, especially for the Middle Ages, sort of element after element, in this, in fact, sort of medieval, notional, anecdotal way. Right, of course, these videos are, as you understand, individually pretty deep dives into pretty hardcore military culture and events. Here, my Crusades history playlist has 71 videos. I see. It's not like we have talked so few about it. It's just that, of course, like adding, it means to refine. Means to really provide with a much more consistent level of insight that you can't really find if you simply say, go by slogans, right? Popularization of history is, of course, in part of what I'm doing, but when I read how bigger channels are doing basically popularization, acquainting people with this sort of, I don't know how they choose that though, like, it's just popularization. Isn't there a passion? Isn't there a purpose of it all? Like, it's of course difficult not to see that there is some sort of obvious agenda. Like, everybody has an agenda. Like, with some agendas there's really nothing wrong. But you also have to ask yourself, how do you present these stories? Because it seems to me that what most people do when they make this kind of content is largely essentially sticking to what people want to hear, like the kind of vulgata and sort of preferences and references to topics that became popular and that can give them clicks, views, etc. And that also have this, of course, very short span attention in many ways. Definitely they're not like my videos that are incredibly long, and I understand that they're boring in the sense that, of course, it's just images, it's just me speaking, but I think at least we're getting to the actual core of the issue. We're not treating people like they're dumb, even though people are. So I place myself like in the average, in the group at least, and I think that's also the most important thing that you can actually point out, in the sense that if you don't really expose what the issues are with the conception of these days and age, really you can't quite make people grow. You can't really tell them, look, this is what you can improve your visual through. You can't sort of understand better this time history. Naturally, I can't avoid to make a final point about Battle of Tagliacozzo per se, because this is such an important battle under so many points of view that really just can't but be extremely straightforward about the whole thing. Tagliacozzo is easily one of the most important battles in the Middle Ages. It's also one deeply loaded with archetypal meaning that I will again address on some other occasion to be, if anything, more effective in it, because we haven't even talked too much about the Hohenstaufen themselves, right? So it takes definitely some time before fully acknowledging the entirety of the war. We talked about Frederick II's majesty, ideology. We talked about so many issues connected. For example, this point is very important for the historiography of the time. From the sources you read, the papal and the same Swabian propaganda, telling the truth, the issues between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, as understood also more religiously, they existed and they were deeply felt in that sense, and this is often overlooked. But again, the intertwinement is always more complex than basically anything I've ever seen. Like any attempt to archetypally tie this to the reality is mostly a failure. Like while it is true that contemporary historiography does not talk about this because it feels too much sort of right wing, it is nevertheless something we should recover. It's definitely there. It was definitely felt, and sort of when you understand it, you say, that's why that idea. That's where they were coming from with that. And of course, this requires digging about it much earlier. However, there is also so much that I can do. I mean, making these videos daily is important. I mean, all the things I learn myself through them are really invaluable. They help me tremendously with my work, but of course you have to give me a bit of time because we need to cover so many things that it can't be just tomorrow, right? I can't think about it, but then whatever we cover at this point is also what we may not successfully cover later. So it's a pretty mess to handle. It's beautiful, but it also takes time. So anytime this is the first time, for example, I talk about the Palentinian Plains, and it's after several years I'm here, so this shows in many ways how difficult it all really is. But without all the rest of the content, you wouldn't even understand this the way you do instead. So that's always what you should think about. There is plenty of stuff I made, right? Just the recent video about the Guelph and Ghibelline armies. Give it a chance. Like, see, for example, what happened in that sense after Tagliacozzo, right? It's not really it's all that intertwined. It's not just about the videos I make daily. It's the entire thing. I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to give you all the pieces that you can combine together, because they are all conceived like that. The reason why they're not literally united is that, again, I can't make so much at a moment. I have to make separated videos, but everything is intertwined. So missing the opportunity of seeing this from, by the way, a PhD in medieval history, I think, is a bit criminal, especially considering the type of content that flourishes on YouTube. That is just, it's not history, right? It's something else. Let's be honest. This is also not like I would make history professionally. This is a YouTube video. It's another thing. However, for today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.